we are in our last meeting of just the creation subcommittee. Next week, you can mark your calendars. I'll send out a calendar invite as well, though. We'll be meeting as one task force at 5 p.m. on the 22nd for our final task force meeting to review the report and hopefully, if schedules allow, hear from the mayor, but otherwise a chance to come together and celebrate all of the work that's been done. And then certainly this is hardly the end. It's really the beginning of getting to implement all of this great work. So today what we're going to do is just an overview. I'm going to show the outline of what the report is looking like. That is, outline was produced with your co-chairs and your subcommittee co-chairs. And then Ed will lead the discussion on reviewing the high priority recommendations. Those were surfaced through your survey results, but then the in-person session last week helped flesh out the language and try to capture what bold statements we wanted to proclaim in those high priority recommendations. And then we'll have a discussion of values. So while the recommendations are the tactical mechanics, what policies we want to see implemented, the values are the lenses that we want to carry out throughout any policy or funding or tool development that will help shape what Nashville becomes. So for the report overview, I'm using PowerPoint today just for purposes of discussion. Thankfully, RJ Young is the graphic designer for Metro, and we're using some Barnes funding to do some graphic design so that the report reflects and visualizes all of the work that you all have done. But just for the purposes of today, wanted to try to represent where we're headed. So it'll start with a letter from the mayor, sort of, thanking you all for this work, sharing some of the higher level things that I know we want to have included, such as, that we'll be tracking the federal investments coming, that will be flexible based on, a lot of inputs that are going to be coming to our city. And that he's committed to activating every asset, and that I certainly think that's a theme that I've heard from this group. And then thankfully, Nick and Ed will be writing your co-chairs letter to try to represent your all's work and share about how you all faced this work. And then, a bit of a call to action to our peers, knowing that this group represents a lot of other stakeholders and stakeholder groups. And then something that came up in the subcommittee or the co-chairs meeting yesterday was to make sure that we communicate where this report sits in time and space. So we know that we did not start from square one, that we intentionally wanted to build upon some of the work that's been done, especially in the last 3 to 5 years with Nashville Next and the 2017 housing report. And so making sure that that's communicated, that we provide some context for where this group started from, and that informed our focus for the next 3 years to try to focus on short term, where we can have high impact, and then where we can use that momentum to, of course, build for the long term, knowing that everyone here is committed to that long term. And then try to represent some of the community engagement that's been done, and then also forecast that this will be an ongoing process of community engagement, both as we develop the tools and then also as we measure and monitor them to see how they need to be adjusted going forward. Then we'll reflect our values. So, and something that came up in the last subcommittee meeting was sort of how long each of these will be. So we anticipate that process, values, and goals and impact statement will be, all together in a few pages. So that's not something that we're intending to be especially lengthy, and especially the values and goal, that those will be something that people could see sort of in correlation to see how those values impact the goal and then flow right into the recommendations. So the values will be what we discussed today, shooting for 4 values and making sure that the language reflects the values, viewing those as a lens that we put on every time we're developing a policy or funding, and then a bit of an educational tool for some of our partners, and how can we help use this as a chance to level set language and level set our values as a city. And then the goal and impact statement, of course, we don't want to just share what we're doing. We want to share, of course, where we're going. So that's where we'll talk about some of the high-level data. And again, we'll put the meat of the data, the graphs, et cetera, at the end. And we wanted to find that balance so that people understand that data informed the process, but that we don't lose people in the graphs at the beginning. So that's where we'll see sort of here's what we're targeting, here's what we're going towards, and then we'll move into the high impact recommendations. And so how those will work is, again, we want to do a bit of an executive summary with those so that people can see sort of at a glance how the task force has landed in terms of focus. And then, as we've said, all of the recommendations that you all provided will be incorporated in the following pages. And then we'll have the data, which, as Greg has done a great job showing, is really those three pieces: the supply and the demand, the inventory tracking, and then how we're forecasting the impact of tools. So that's an overview of the report outline. Your subcommittee co-chairs and co-chairs are assisting in developing those pieces. But any questions about that outline before we move into the high impact recommendations?
I see Dwayne has his hand up. It's the only one I see right now. Dwayne, you have a comment or question about the outline?
Yeah. Are we going to like go from, I was in that meeting a week ago yesterday. I haven't seen, you know, the version, but of those recommendations, but are we going to like take those recommendations and figure out how to mold them into something that produces some units? I'm just struggling with how we're going to get through a report in the next hour and 15 minutes and then have one final meeting and come up with something meaningful that that we can look at and go, that will produce units in Nashville starting within the next 12 months. Am I just missing something?
Well, I would say, Dwayne, I don't think you're missing anything. I think, again, our goal as a collective task force is to put together not only a report, right, of just our doings and our recommendations, but also an action plan. And so to your point, there will be an action plan, and that narrative will flow through the report. It won't just be we suggest. It'll be we suggest with some emphasis on how. And of course, the when. We've always had our, I guess, our gaze locked in on a 1 to 3 year time frame, and so in order for that to be effective, there will definitely have to be movement within a 12-month period.
Maybe I misunderstood. I mean, I've had this question from several people that are not on the committee who are just like, is anything meaningful going to come out of it? And the question has been, are we talking about something that over the next 1 to 3 years we can figure out how to adopt with the notion that there'll be preservation and more creation thereafter? Or are we talking about doing something in the next couple of, next month or two that will produce units and preserve units in the next 3 years?
Well, I'm certainly have plans for the next month with budget coming up. So there's the recommendation for the increase in Barnes Fund this year, based on the recommendations I've heard from you all, working on the pilot legislation to be included in the upcoming budget, and looking to have an RFP for some of our public land in the next 3 to 6 months. So this is, to be clear, not something that's intended to sit on the shelf. I know that we talked about, how much detail do you want to put into a public report? I'm conscious of the fact that we want to be able to be flexible internally, if we see that something is coming from the feds, we can adjust our timeline, et cetera. But no, this is intended to be units unlocked, funded, land going out the door in the starting once you guys, finalize and publish the report. But that's sort of like, in the next month, in the next 3 months, that granular level of detail is not necessarily going to be in the report. Is that what you're asking, Dwayne?
Well, yeah, I'm sorry to be granular about it, but I'm just wondering if we're going to, or somebody put it to me, when the rubber meets the road. We've been talking at a high level on a number of different things, and that's fine. I'm just wondering if, because as somebody said to me last week, well, if you're asking for more money, well, of course you can ask for more money, but we didn't have to meet for 3 months to say, if you give me more money, I'll give you more units. So I'm just wondering if there's a plan to sort of combine things.
Yeah, so, and I appreciate the level of granularity. I know I've had individual conversations with a number of you about sort of the pockets. I'm conscious of not having that across the entire task force because, people bring different expertise to the table. So to me, I think we've gotten to a much better depth than just more money. And I, of course, hope you do as well. I know with, for example, the pilot legislation that we're working on, that is, sure, it's more money, but it's, how do we sort of unlock and build tools in a way that is going to get us what we want and leaves us the opportunity to adjust the tool towards our greater goal.
Thank you, Hannah.
Really, really quick, Hannah, and before we flip to the recommendations, I want to recognize Dr. Coleman has her hand raised, and I don't know if anyone else might have comments or questions about the outline of the report. Dr. Coleman, if you're speaking, you're still on mute.
Good afternoon, and I'm sorry. I have a question about the definition of future beyond the 3 years.
Great, okay.
What time frame are we talking about?
Can you be a little bit more specific?
Yeah, we've referenced that we are making plans for the 1 to 3 years and beyond. And I'm just asking, what does beyond translate to? Is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? Is it 5 years? Is it what? What is it?
Well, I know that from the beginning, there was talk of doing the 10-year plan. We chose not to do that, knowing that, that's an extensive planning process and that we can do that, and then 2 years from now, if we see that we've made a lot of progress and we want to explore sort of how we then take it to the next level. So right now, the data that we have goes to 2030. And so those are the numbers that I've been referencing in terms of, our projected unit deficit and where we can make interventions against that.
Okay. And this is related to Dwayne's question, which is a question I have raised. This will be my 3rd time. I did it in writing. I did it in a meeting, and Mick answered it basically what I wanted to hear, but I still don't see it. What are we going to be saying about how we're going to reduce the barriers so that we can create and preserve more units?
Well, I think where we landed with the recommendations, like Mick had said, was an analysis of basically what the investment can be and what the unit impact of that investment would be. And so that's one place where I see the data and the analysis that Greg's done coming into play, is being able to say, if you increase the investment this way, here's what that will translate into, and here's the way that we can get to a place in 2030 where we're not at that deficit.
So basically the preservation and creation of units is drawn out to 2030.
Based on the data that we currently have, yes.
Dr. Coleman, does that sound like a good time frame to you? I guess what is it, 9 years?
No, not at all.
Yeah. Yeah, tell us more. Sort of what's your sort of what do you think?
As I have said before, my expectation was that the work of this committee would yield a projected number of units that needed to be preserved or created, and that it would be done within a very, very short period of time. That because we had the vast array of people around the table, not everybody that perhaps needed to be here, but more than are usually around the table, then we could be more proactive in reducing the barriers. And it's kind of like beyond money or in addition to money.
Yeah, so I think, and let me know if I'm thinking if we're thinking about this the same way, which I have a hunch that we are, but I want to make sure that that's right and get other people's thoughts on it too, if that makes sense. But part of it is okay, what's going to happen in the next 3 years? What kind of investments and changes we're going to recommend that the city makes? How much is that going to cost? How many units is that going to do? Then, so that's the sort of 1 to 3 year time frame, sort of speaking to what Dwayne was asking about too. Then, but also it probably makes sense for us to have a longer time horizon beyond that as well. So 1 to 3 years, this is what we expect to happen. This is what we're asking for the city and its stakeholders to invest and make changes, and it's going to result in this many units. And then beyond that, we want to get to a certain point by 2030 based on Greg's analysis. Is that would that sort of fit what you're looking for, or how would you change?
No. It's more of the same, kicking the can down the road. And I know that there are data and there are practices and there are policies that have to be perhaps revamped or adjusted, but I expected that to be happening on a kind of turbocharged perspective or trajectory.
So would it be good
When you answered the last time, you seem to be going in that direction, or maybe I just wanted to hear that and that's what I received, and that may not have been what you said.
No, I feel like we're like, and I just want to, so would what I've said been better, or does it fit more what you're thinking in terms of, okay, this is what's going to, okay, let's talk about the next 3 years. In the next, breaks that down the next 3 years into sort of 12-month increments. By when we do the 2022 budget, it's going to say this, and it's going to have this changes, and there's going to be these policy changes. And that's going to be all occurred by June of next year. And then the following year, this and this and this is going to happen. So instead of just talking about, that big 3 year, which can be a little bit amorphous and, oh, we didn't get it done this year, we'll get it done next year, we'll see what happens. If it's more broken down, does that sound better?
The problem is, and perhaps my expectation was misplaced, was that there would be some numbers of units produced and preserved within the 3 years. And I don't hear that at this juncture.
Dr. Coleman, we haven't got there yet, but when we dive into our recommendations, one of the things that will present itself is annual targets for creation. And largely that is based off of purely calculations around what the Affordable Housing Trust or the Barnes Fund has been doing. And then everything on top of that, I believe our other recommendations are more enabling and or propelling activities, right? So we have captured that there is a metric and a standard and expectation of what we hope to deliver. I would say probably a minimum is the better way to say it, a minimum that we expect to deliver with our recommendations. And then we believe that everything else that we're recommending only is additive to that figure.
Thank you.
Well, Dwayne, your hand is still up. So if you did have a comment, I wanted to recognize you. And Dr. Coleman, I know your hand's probably just up from this past comment.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I took my hand down and brought it back up, and I don't want to speak for Dr. Coleman, but although she and I had an opportunity to talk, at length last week. And I think, you know, again, none of us have seen the recommendations for the creation committee yet, and that will be informative. But if it's all predicated on give us more money and we'll give you more units, then I'm not sure that we've achieved much of anything. If it's just with the Barnes Fund, again, we put together 3 months, and we're trying to figure out ways to do it ourselves without necessarily saying to a city that doesn't have money, give us more money. So if something like that's going to unfold in the next hour, that'd be great. And I'm sorry to have wasted your time asking redundant questions.
No worries, Dwayne. All this is setting the stage for the conversation we want to have. Kia, thanks for joining us. Happy to have you as our co-chair. But I see your hand is up, so if you'd like to make comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe ask if we could maybe push forward, and I think we're going to answer some of these questions.
Fair enough. Well, if there are no other questions about the report outline, I think we take Kia's suggestion moving forward.
All right. Ed, do you want to, I know some of the folks on here were attendees at that in-person, but do you want to sort of remind
Absolutely.
people of the survey process and then how we've arrived at these?
Absolutely. So, great work as a collective, filling out the survey, and then also to my co-chair, Mick, for putting together a process that somewhat weighted and distilled that survey feedback to give us a starting point for our work last week as we put together what we consider the high impact recommendations. But what you will likely see is a former version of what was responded to in the survey, combined and refined with the language you'll be getting presented this evening. I want to state this because I know it came up earlier as well. No recommendations that were made are being removed, but this is a collection that's more of a, I guess what I would say, a true blend of both subcommittees, but also each individual's contributions. And so what we're going to talk through tonight are those recommendations in that compiled format. And again, this is still opportunity for your feedback. I'll go through each one and give them context. I don't believe that any one of our committee members are only on the phone, so I won't read them to you word for word. I feel like that's probably not the best use of time, but if anyone is on the phone and would prefer to have one read to them, let me know. It just doesn't appear to be that way. Starting off into Dwayne's point, kind of foreshadowing, we did start with the Barnes Fund. It was one of the, what I would say, higher ranking in terms of our survey suggestions for what our high impact recommendation should be. And not only more dollars to the Barnes Fund, but also I think to Dwayne's point, not just more money, but a better and more structured and hopefully more sustainable and predictable access to those dollars. We wanted to make sure that the Barnes Fund, if it is our city's primary tool, there is no need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to better utilize that wheel. And I think that's what's represented by the first high impact recommendation. And again, to Dr. Coleman's point, there is a target for annual units to be produced. And so with this informing not only the city, but the Barnes Fund Commission, as well as all of those who would intend to use those funds, that we definitely have a target and what we would like to see as our desires. The second is somewhat of a combination of two very prominent recommendations. We continue to have conversations throughout our time together about the creation of a housing department, and or at least just clearly more capacity dedicated to our housing focus inside of our government. The other component that gained a lot of traction and became quite heavily responded to in the survey is just the need to collect, compile, and utilize data, and to keep our data more current, right? So that we could be more responsive and react in a better fashion. So again, when you think about that data and that process, of course, there has to be the people factor of who's actually pulling that together. And so those two things seem to marry well together. And essentially, we talked about it a lot as a group. We're spending this time, very similar to what Dwayne said, putting this together. Where does it live? Who's responsible? Who's accountable? And so having a department that carries this forward was quite a prominent recommendation. The third one and the final one on this page, there are more pages. And Gina, I see your hand. Do you want to, just because we do want to address these as we're going through them, do you want to jump in on one of the items I've mentioned?
I had a question, and I'll ask it quickly because it may just be further. So for the first one, for the Barnes Fund, I see more dollars there. Was there any piece to the recommendation of making more of a revolving fund that could happen throughout the year?
Gina, can you speak up a little bit? Sorry to interrupt, but I don't know if others weren't able to hear, but it wasn't coming through at my end.
Okay, is that better? I was asking if on the Barnes Fund one, if, I see there's more funding related there. Was there anything as far as making that fund more than a one-time a year or two-time a year application, but instead more of the revolving? Because I know as the commission, we would find that to be more helpful for creating units when they came about. It may be further down the list, so I'm just asking, and sorry if it is.
No, I think so, Gina. Well, great question. I think again, understanding, and maybe this is probably where I should have started. The recommendations and their formatting is more distilled and refined. I think from a more tactical action plan workbook style of document, those things are going to be articulated, not necessarily in just our high level overview of recommendations. So I think I just want to say that. So if there's something that people see not in enough detail here, please express that to us. But just know that those comments have not been lost. But to your point, yes, it is surmised in the term reliable and predictable. And so to the point you made about it being revolving and having more opportunities for access, another comment that came up quite often and would be very viable is to have a leading or a projecting commitment to those dollars so that organizations are able to plan, build a time frame around not necessarily what's available at this current opportunity, but being able to look 2 and 3 years ahead and make projections on what may be in the pipeline or what they could even get in the pipeline because they know the opportunity is there. Looking, I don't see other hands. So I'm gonna move on to the strike fund. Again, a very prominent recommendation. Just creating a funding mechanism for more what we consider opportunistic investments, both for the creation, but a lot of the really dynamic conversations about this were around preserving units that may have some type of expiring subsidy or anything that may be prohibiting them from being from remaining affordable in the future. So whether that could be a natural occurring increase of rents or demand on a particular area of town, but creating a strike fund that allowed affordable housing to take priority, right? But then also have the financial ability to compete in a free market and or to supersede or jump ahead of what may be happening. We have the data to know when there's some burn-offs for some affordable units. But again, that information is only useful if you can do something about it. And so creating a strike fund to do that. We don't want our gap to grow and work against us as we're trying to create and populate our community with new units. Hannah, would you move to the next slide? I didn't see any hands pop up there. Hannah alluded to this just a tad bit earlier, but again, when we talk about what our city has as assets, and again, not necessarily reinventing a wheel, but being more selective and prioritizing what we do with public land, finding opportunities to where we can create housing on land that is owned by the city and or some counterpart. or municipal adjacent entity really is a strategy that we need to employ. We discussed and found there were great examples in other municipal districts that have done well. And we also feel like there needs to be strategic acquisition. So not necessarily just using the public land that's currently owned, but acquisitions that are made when we know the city is going to obtain and or place a more impactful investment into a community. I think it goes without saying, and most of us know this, that when a municipality invests in an area, typically private dollars come behind that, and so it increases land costs, it increases or it decreases the likelihood of affordability to either remain or be produced in the future. And so being proactive and having a complete strategy around land and other investments that the city makes. State policy, which has been one of our topics since the very beginning, that's been heavily debated, and I think we have found through experience that that's an area that we will just have to tackle if we really want to make the type of impact that we're all so passionate about. And to Dr. Coleman's point, if we really want to make that impact in a short period of time, this is an area where we have to begin our work immediately. But what we have phrase our recommendation as is identifying collaborative regional and statewide allies. So not just going to the table, just as the city of Nashville, just as our metropolitan government, but a more regional approach. And then also just finding ways to look at tools that are there that can be repurposed. So again, not reinventing the wheel, but finding a strategy that is more short-term, has more short-term viability. One of those things that popped up was the real estate transfer tax. I think, again, going back and looking at language that has been approved or is currently in place and just finding ways for it to be better leveraged for the creation of affordable housing. So I think there's some opportunities for quick or short wins, and then also an overall strategy for longer term impact. Don't see any questions. When I pause, I'm just checking to see if there are any hands up. I know I'm moving through it, but I do want people to feel comfortable asking questions. So the pilot, again, we have pilots. I think we found that they typically or have exclusively only supported LIHTC projects. We're making a push for them to be pilots that support non-LIHTC developments. And again, looking at the requirements on those pilots, whether it be extending them to preserve greater affordability further into the future, or ways to leverage them so that we're able to achieve the affordability metrics that we would like. So whether that is number of units, whether that is the targeted AMI areas, but again, another tool that is already present, but we just need to utilize it better and or revamp how it can be used. And then of course the education piece of it, but this is also an access component. We have some tools, quite a few tools that are only accessible by a few, but we know that this is the type of work that will need the many. And so really looking at all of the tools in our toolkit to say, how do we empower more people in this effort to build more affordability? And I'm going to ask if you move to the next slide. So our final two, and giving us a grand total of 8 high impact recommendations, tackling zoning. We've had quite a few discussions about how zoning is really produced a great amplifier for gentrification in a way, because as land value goes up, what happens is you are forcing people out. There's great demand for the land, but with the land prices where they are, minimal density, then of course you just have higher prices on homes. And so really looking at ways to strategically allocate density in all neighborhoods and all communities, but also to really take a stab at planning's approach to communicating the city's overall approach, but planning's approach at communicating the need to change our zoning. Dr. Coleman, I think that might be you. You're not muted. Would you mute for us, please? And so we've talked about a couple of different ways that that could be impactful, but also a communication strategy to go along with or partner with the technical discussion around density. We know that there's a lot of NIMBYism and a lot of just resistance to change. Council member Allen has been very vocal about her efforts to just increase accessory dwelling units inside of certain part or across the community, and she's got a lot of pushback that she did not expect. But I think many people would articulate that there's just not a good understanding about what that zoning would allow, and so not only making those changes or pushing to make those changes, but the education around it. And then last, but most definitely not least, is to empower the city to financially support MDHA's envisioning process. MDHA is the greatest landowner that has affordable units today, and it is their core mission to create more affordable units. So it seems to be the most simplistic and natural partnership. But also encourage the inclusion of private developers in and around those spaces as well, finding ways to utilize neighboring assets as development is planned and happening in the envision process. Kia and I won't speak for Kia, but Kia and I were both part of the Envision Edge Hill process. And I think one of the things that was honestly most disheartening for me was, you put together and you work with the community and you create a great plan. But the timeline of delivering on that plan is just so long. And again, dollars do accelerate things. I mean, that's the reality and the nature of the world we live in. And so with MDHA in a prime position as a property holder and a desire to create more affordability, finding the best approach to support the envision process. So I did power through those. I do appreciate everyone for chiming in when they did. Before we move on, we want to take the time to just again open the floor for comments about those. But we do have more on the agenda, so we will be mindful of time. But again, this is the time period for you to react or respond to the efforts of our committee last week and really distilling what we saw and what we thought was the most prominent recommendations and the ones that would have the highest impact in terms of both units. And as I phrased it, I think during our conversation is they are barrier removing and momentum building. As much as we would love to close the gap in 1 to 3 years, it won't happen. Like that, just reality. But we also want to make sure that our city is moving in the right direction, and that we won't be in the same place 3 years from now. And so, how do we take that momentum and continually close the gap that we see now and that we projected to see growing? How do we invert that? Dr. Shin, I do see your hand, and then Emily, I see your hand after Dr. Shin.
So what I would love to see is how we expect these recommendations to advance racial equity and economic equity. To what extent are we going to get units that are available below 30% of area median? To what extent are we going to promote racial equity in our community through any of these? Thank you.
A great comment, Dr. Shin. And again, I think as we talk about the use of pilots and as we talk about working with Envision, there clearly are areas where we would like to focus on that would impact those areas that you discussed. But the values, which is part of our discussion following this, will highlight exactly what we want to be the focus, right? So the values embody not only what our group has seen and used the lens in making our recommendations, but also the values we want to pass on to those who have to carry the torch forward. And one of those, just I guess, a little bit of a spoiler alert, but the very first one on there is racial equity. And so it's going to be clearly identified in our report as a value. And hopefully that addressed the answered the question, Dr. Shin. If it did not, please continue to lean in.
Well, I guess, you know, it's wonderful to have a statement of values, but if the statement of values isn't instantiated in the recommendations, it's only a statement of values. And so I'd want to make sure that the recommendations themselves lead us to, and we can project that this is going to increase racial and economic equity in our community.
Understood. I'll pull a Mick here. How would you suggest that that is better incorporated, Dr. Shin?
Well, if there were specific recommendations that talked about production of units at different levels of income, if there were specific recommendations that talked about use of housing choice vouchers, if there were specific recommendations about fair housing issues, I just don't, I don't see those in the set of recommendations that are coming forward, but.
So I'll respond to that with my own personal opinion, and then Emily, I'll let you weigh in. The sense, I guess, the trend or the theme that I'm getting, and Hannah and Mick, you can tell me, and anybody else who may have been on the call earlier, our task force seems to want more meat in our recommendations presented. I think clearly those factors are there, but the feedback and the trend that I'm seeing is that our recommendations might seem too fluffy, for lack of a better way to say it, and too 30,000 feet. And so, you know, just as a mental note, I'm making that it seems like there's more of a task-oriented technical aspect to our recommendations that seems to be absent to at least some of our task force members' level of comfort. So I just wanted to make that statement. It's something I'm noticing.
Thank you.
Emily, yeah, sorry, Emily, yes, I just wanted to make that statement, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to what Beth said, and I entirely agree. And Ed, I think you hit the nail on the head for me, where, you know, I feel like this group has really dug in deep into some hot, like nitty gritty details around, you know, certain things, like, you know, putting together a strike fund, for instance, can be done in a way where it's absolutely useless and barely gets deployed, or it can be done in a way where, you know, we're really actually doing, you know, targeted approaches to get permanently supportive housing for homeless populations. And I guess I'm a little perplexed with the level that we're at right now, because I don't have confidence with how these are written that we are necessarily going to result in, you know, the maximum impact that we're shooting for. So, you know, zoning is another one. The way that this is written, it has me very concerned. You know, just increasing supply, we see all day long that will still end up serving higher income households. So unless we're talking about changing zoning with some innovative kind of grant programs that, you know, does things to actually create affordable housing with that increased density, or requires things like accepting vouchers if you take a grant, or, you know, get some added density or those kinds of things, I'm concerned about, you know, will we actually get to those economic and racial equity outcomes we're shooting for? But I also feel like it might be helpful if you guys could take a step back from, you know, I'm unclear how we went from what the top ranking of the survey results were to these recommendations here, but most of us weren't at that day, that in-person, you know, event. So it might be helpful if you just shed a little bit of light around what you all did in that process so that maybe we can follow along.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I believe so, but if I start at the wrong place, somebody jump in and correct me. But I do believe that the survey results were shared across the task force as a whole. So everyone saw those. And so I believe now the gap to be filled in is from when that email of the results came out to today. And what we wanted to tackle and to make the what we felt was the best use of our time in person was, now that we have these results, there's clear patterns and trends. And that was what I tried to articulate earlier, that a few things were very, very much outweighing others. And so we took those somewhat arbitrarily, but we took those and drew a line and said, okay, these are the things that have the greatest buy-in, the greatest support. Now, how can those be articulated into actual recommendations? Because there was quite abundant list of items on the survey. And so again, as we walked through it and distilled it to 8, it was, let's get a starting point based off of what were the highest rated in the survey. And then as we work through it, let's see if we need to tweak, augment, add, or subtract. That is the basis of how we started our day. And then as we worked through the day, we did, of course, we self-evaluated, right? We understood we were representatives for the entire task force. Are we missing anything? And we did an exercise that talked about the blind spots. Is there something that we're missing? We had a set of core values to begin with that were around access, around equity, around policy, around funding. Are those represented in our recommendations? Is there anything that was a critical topic that came up over and over again in our conversations that in no way, or at least not in an impactful way, can be addressed by our recommendations? And I think what is not present here and being presented to you again is the detail behind these recommendations. I don't think anything is left off, but I think again, without that level of detail, it's creating a certain level of discomfort. And I had the pleasure of being in the room, right? So I understand we're approaching it from two different perspectives. But in essence, there was presentation, refinement, review, discussion, reflection outside of a technical aspect, but truly looking at it from, we all are people, and morally, did we do our duty? And then as we go back through it, are these things that not only they won't be a flash in the pan, but they will be sustainable in the long term. But what can we do after that to start within 1 to 3 years? And so that's where I would say the reality component came in, right? What can we realistically do? And so you saw me, or you heard me refer a lot to tools that are already in place that may just need to be modified versus going out and inventing something completely new. Aside from the strike fund, I think most of our recommendations are really just modifying or working to better relationships or create more stronger communication or add capacity. Everything else, aside from the strike fund, everything else is a building upon what we already have. And so I think all those factors went into it. And then at the end of the day, it was distilled down to what I would think may be a challenge for us, Hannah, and everyone else, is what audience is this for, right? Because we did talk about how the report is a document that will not be for us, right? I mean, as much as we love our work and what we've done, our pride of authorship will fall far, far, far secondary to what the community actually can digest and receive. And so I think right now what we've done is create recommendations and phrase them in a simplistic manner for what I would say is more for general consumption, not necessarily a technical practitioner. And like I said earlier, I want everyone to feel confident that meat is there. It hasn't been abandoned. But I think we need to discuss exactly how that's presented in the report. If the report is the product, right? How do we present that? And hopefully I did a good job. Again, anybody else who's in the room, by all means, be additive to my comments. But I hope I did a good job giving a summary. And Dwayne, you have your hand up. By all means, you can chime in.
Oh no, I was in the room. My point is, I think there are a number of people, myself included, who thought that at the end of this venture, that we would have something meaningful to provide back to show the work that we put into it. I can appreciate all the things that we have as recommendations. I also don't think it would have taken 3 months to figure that out. And I think there are a number of people who are thinking that at the end of this road, we would be able to say, these are things that we can actually do right now, as opposed to make a kind of a generic recommendation and hope something falls into our lap at a later date. And I may be wrong. There are a number of people online. They can tell me if I'm completely out of place or misunderstood what we thought we were doing when we agreed months and months ago to say, yeah, we'll sign on to be a part of this task force.
I don't see any other hands. Dwayne, look, I'm gonna agree with you candidly. I mean, I think your point that you're making is why, and I won't speak for anyone else, but why I at least feel like there's so much passion in the argument for a housing department, because we can do all of this, but who gets it and does something with it, right? And I think that truly is again, it's something that we all want to happen. Unfortunately, this isn't most of our, if any, our first rodeo in trying to make change in this area. And we've all been frustrated by the lack of movement when you put forth so much effort and energy. I feel like our goal is to put something out there, and I think Hannah's been active in that behind the scenes, and she's touched on some of that of what we will see put in front of our mayor, what we will see put in front of our council members in the next couple weeks and months. I don't see any other
you're
hand.
right, Edward.
Yeah,
maybe I misread the room. Thank you.
Dwayne, I don't think you misread the room. Of course, I can only speak for myself. I'm wondering if the co-chairs of our committee have anything that they want to add from the process or how they're feeling.
So Kelsey, I see your hand. You go ahead.
I think I also obviously had the benefit of being in the room. And I think just to be clear and kind of reiterate that, these are not the end of the recommendation. Like, this would maybe be a summary statement that an advocate or an ally could take and run with in their own work. But within these, there are specific technical action steps that we can essentially charge the planning department or the Barnes Commission to, like, those are the people who will actually be implementing things. So I think for me, at least, this, for example, this statement about zoning is really high level and big picture and not super helpful as an implementation thing. So I think, to me, it's obvious that there are action steps within each of these that need to be articulated. And they're not shown on this slide, but they do exist in all the recommendations that were sourced from this group. So I think just making that connection between what's shown on this slide and what is actually, in the report and in the recommendations. Yeah.
I appreciate that, Kelsey. Gina, I see your hand. Would you go ahead?
Yeah, and it's more of a question, and Dwayne and Emily, I do agree with you as well, and I think probably everyone is really saying the same thing a different way. So these detailed recommendations that you kind of referenced, Kelsey, I mean, this is a high level thing that we're all reviewing together, but you are saying in the report some of these more detailed items are going to be listed in that report, because I think, kind of like Dwayne said earlier, for me, the hardest part of this has been saying, like, when we go from here to really charging people with these tasks, there really does have to be a list, like, hey, planning, we're going to give you this, like you just said, Kelsey, and you're going to try to do these things. And, maybe we don't prescriptively say how you're going to do them. That is your expertise. You're going to do them. But really just thinking, like, we're going from this report, and this may just be a high level piece of that report for us to go through, and there may be a much more detailed report that will go out. And that's more my question. But just really understanding, when we're going back out and talking to people, like Dwayne said, people have certainly been asking me as well. I really want to articulate properly what is going to happen and not overpromise something if that's really not going to happen. So that it's probably more questions, I think, than statements.
Well, Hannah, I think, not to put you on the spot, but I think it's worth discussing how you see the report as a document, right? So we're talking a couple weeks from now, and I get a shiny version of it and I hand it to somebody. What's in it and what's not in it, right? As an expectation. Not that it's set in stone, but as an expectation right now. And before you say that, and maybe more time to think, I'm curious if there is a report like what we talk about here, but then I have the pleasure of working within government, so it's probably best if it's articulated. But an action plan, and then what I would consider more of like a workbook, right? Like there's a tactical strategy. Those things aren't usually in reports, right? So I think it might be good to share at least a little bit, even if it's bullet point style, of kind of how you see this, because a lot of people look to you and think about you're our representative inside the mayor's office here, and then John as a counterpart from the policy perspective. I mean, how do you guys see this being publicly received? What will be content, and then internally, what will be happening?
Well, so I do view this a little bit as like a 201, and we can point to other resources that exist as a 101. So we talked about that a little bit earlier today. So the audience being, not necessarily totally pedestrian, but that there obviously is an on-ramp, which I think these summaries of the recommendations are helpful in that if someone doesn't want to get into the nitty-gritty of zoning, they can say, oh, okay, this is at a high level what they're going to address. And, in the report, obviously, the recommendations can fall under these specific headers. But yeah, I mean, I think the small group meetings that I've been helping to organize are sort of helping to inform and develop that work plan. So, while this says have a non-LIHTC pilot, what are the specifics of that? While this says put public land to use, what are the specifics of that? What's the timeline for that? And what are the stages of that beyond just, okay, here's the initial thing we can do. And I've tried to, I think, come back and share some of those with you all without getting into the day-to-day of my work plan. But for example, with public property, knowing that we have some initial wins, being able to put out RFPs for lands that are already within, Metro's holdings, and being able to put those out. And then also longer term, being able to incorporate housing into other Metro developments, and then being able to do some strategic acquisitions. So I think in each of these, there's the short-term, mid-term, and long-term with the 1, 2, and 3 years. So some of that is taking shape. And then some, like you said, zoning or envision, those lie outside of just our office's control. So those will involve other departments and council and other partners. But in terms of how I see the report, I mean, this is a reflection of your all's work. So this is the chance to make sure that if you have something that you want captured, it's in here. If there's something that you're not happy with, this is the chance to, change that, double down, outline with more specificity the recommendations. Like Ed said, they will all be included and categorized under these high-level recommendations. But, from my perspective, I want to make sure that I have captured all of your expertise. So if there's something that's not in here, I, want to see that, because then that gives us the chance to be able to go inform the work plan, go have those conversations, be able to start to schedule in, that's going to be something long-term, or that's going to be something that we can start right away. So, that this is my call to you all, that if there is something that you're feeling frustrated with, I mean, anytime there's a large group process, there's going to be, stops and starts and a feeling of, oh, we spent too much time there or not enough time there. But if we need to go back and, go to ground zero with the recommendations to make sure that we capture them, that's something, of course, that we can do. This is your all's process and your all's time, and the mayor's office is here to guide. And, but I think, I'm here to make sure that I take these and begin implementing them. So if there's something that's not captured here, this is the time to make sure that it is, because then it will inform that work plan.
So thank you, Hannah. So hearing that from Hannah, and Mick, you're unmuted. Did you want to chime in as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of maybe flesh out a little bit more of what Hannah was saying in the context. I'll take the zoning recommendation, and it's like, oh, this is really broad. Well, it's really broad because it captures the survey results where 9 or so people said we should focus on dados, and 9 or so people said we should focus on an overview of total zoning policy, and another set of folks said we should focus on allowing upzoning property that was previously downzoned. And so how do we get that all together? And how do we sort of articulate that in a way that's sort of faithful to the sentiment of the group? And so, on the other hand, our most, from the survey results, the most prominent ones were increasing city funding, specifically about the Barnes Fund, and around $30 million were really things that came out of the group as recommendations. So just want to sort of give more of a sense of, okay, why are some a little bit more specific? Envision is another great one. It wasn't necessarily the highest thing, but it was, there's only a couple of recommendations, one in preservation and one in the creation set. And a bunch of people said, yes, we should focus on this. And so it's a relatively straightforward recommendation. The city should help fund the Envision process because it's sitting right there. People are working on it. It just maybe needs to be charged, maybe needs a few more resources to make it happen. And so if there is like, why is this a little bit general and not straightforward? And why is this one really honed in specific with a certain number associated with it? It's kind of what was generated out of the survey results. And that's sort of our group, and that group last week's group goal, I think, and I would almost go far as say is a mandate, was to harness those results and turn them into something that we can then hand to Hannah and say, you start implementing this, and if it's not in your court, you tell someone else to go do it. And so summary wise, and I do think I agree with everyone here in that in the actual document itself, we do need to say what kind of resources are associated with this that need to be dedicated to it. Where are they coming from? What's the production from this? At what sort of timeline, and who's taking the lead? And without that information, I do agree with everyone that that we haven't accomplished what we should have. But I just wanted to sort of give a little bit more fleshing out to sort of the ones that are vague and the ones that are specific, and how that might have come to be.
No, that was great, Mick, and very much appreciated. Well, two things. One, we do have a few more slides that talk about values, and I think it's at least good that we present those to this group, whether or not we decide to dive into those. As Hannah said, this is our process, and so if everyone's like, yeah, values, values, we want to talk about recommendations, then we'll leverage our final 20 minutes on that. But I know Kia had to jump off, but she did shoot a note over. But her recommendation, I think she again understands everyone's concerns, and is somebody who often leans in on the power of words and the presentation and what they mean, not only from the people who present them, but also those that will be receiving them. She suggested that the group have time to digest these, because a lot of people, this is the first time that they're seeing them right in front of them as a distilled version from the survey. And that perhaps there is a need for another meeting to where it is just heavily focused, or solely focused, I guess I should say, just on this topic. I think that again, it's with people's schedule and availability, but it's not something I'm opposed to. But since she's not able to speak for herself now, I wanted to make sure it was known and presented to the committee. Don't see any hands or anyone unmuting. So what I would suggest we do, Hannah, is we want to acknowledge that we've heard you all, and by all means, you know, when the stop recording and the end button to leave this meeting, that does not mean your feedback stops there. So by all means, please give us much more depth and detail to what you think makes this section of what will be our report more impactful and more representative of what your expectations were and are for our process. Yep. So Hannah, if you would move to the values, but I think it's important that, again, you know, exposure to these and having discussion about these is good for our subcommittee, but also, again, for yourself and others who will be working to craft the eventual report. So, and I talked about values earlier on, and I know Kia had to jump off. But Kelsey, maybe you and I can tag team this a bit since you were there. Dwayne, feel free to jump in. Dr. Coleman, as well as Mick. But one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we did was capture the values that were not only present as part of our task force, but also what we felt are important carrying the work forward. And again, we've leaned in quite a bit already this afternoon about the technical aspects and really wanted to make sure that things are detailed and have a great way of being a guide and a playbook for being implemented. But the values are more, as it says, they're a lens for implementation, right? And so I always think about not necessarily the why, but the how you're doing what you're doing. And so, you know, one thing that clearly bubbled to the top across all conversations was racial equity. And Hannah, you know, Bob, still guide me here because I want to make sure the feedback on these is what you want. But innovation and access, connected being in a very broad sense, and then resilience. And I think that really brings a completely new. It just resonates with us all a little bit more differently in our current time. So Hannah, is there a order of operations or procedure you'd like for us to dive into on this slide?
No, what I'm looking for here with you and Kelsey leading is language that we can, the previous subcommittee sort of freeform shared thoughts they had around each of these values, so that then we can take it back and wordsmith into bold statements and language that represents your all's view of these values. And the values, again, being sort of for framing lenses for implementation, how we, you all want to tell the city, you know, these things are what matters to us. If you're coming to Nashville to do business, here's how we do these. And then as directional markers for us as well to sort of check ourselves against as we develop policies and funding.
I think one of the things that Kia has really helpfully framed is each of these as questions of, you know, as we're evaluating a specific recommendation or action step, how does it address, to Dr. Chen's point earlier, how do we expect this recommendation to impact racial equity and economic equity? So using the value not just as a statement saying this is important to us in our housing ecosystem, but using it as a way to evaluate and implement the specific recommendations. And I think we also talked about the importance of not picking and choosing, that these are all important. And so it's not something that is enough to say, yes, this checks the box and is, you know, connected because it's on a transit line. But if it doesn't also work towards building a more resilient and equitable community, then it doesn't meet these requirements. So using them as a lens for evaluating and implementing specific recommendations, and what are the questions that we need to be asking about each of those.
Very well said, Kelsey. But with that, the floor is open for comments, and so I will be monitoring hands, so please don't be shy. I personally do not mind awkward silence, but I also am a person who's very big believer in time efficiency. And so the collective brain power that we have here, I'm sure someone has something to say about one of these four things.
Hannah, do you have the notes from our previous call as prompts to share with the
I
group?
do.
Would that might be a way to approach it?
Yes, I wanted to give creation a chance to start fresh, but
Just so everyone knows, Mick is never going to let me live down the fact that his committee got going on the values and we just all made blank stares at the screen. So thanks everybody for that. So what Hannah has just put up is some of the, and again, shorthand, not complete, but notes that came up, comments and questions and discussion from the preservation committee. What you're seeing now are just the first two of the values. So racial equity as presented to you all, and innovation and access modified to be access and accessibility. Probably better phrasing. I think that was Marshall's comment. I think it was a great one when he dove into it. But take a few moments just to see what they how their discussion went and played out, and some of the comments that came up there, and then we'll take another stab at it.
So I guess I
And
would add economic accessibility or racial and economic equity to this. You know, housing at all incomes, but since housing is available for high incomes, housing at all incomes means that we have to focus on people with low incomes.
Yeah, and Dr. Shin, I had no disagreement in anything that you said. The reason, and I should say I believe, my personal opinion of the reason in recounting conversations from last week and even beforehand is the specificity on racial equity. One, affordability and housing for all should capture economic, right? The affordability component is there. And again, the basis, again, our recommendations don't have that level of detail to them, but addressing all of those economic, we'll call tiers, is already in there. And so we did have a conversation about being explicit with racial equity. And so that's how this developed. I just want to make sure we are all clear as a committee, there's no absence of economic equity at all.
Yeah, and I totally support calling out racial equity, and racial equity will certainly increase economic equity, given the way our society is structured and the kind of historic and ongoing discrimination.
So do you, I mean, again, this is our process and you see that one was already modified. Do you feel it's better stated as racial and economic equity?
No, keep it racial equity, but maybe instead of housing at all incomes, you know, housing at all incomes, including the lowest, or, you know, with a focus on the lowest, or some such that kind of acknowledges that the problem is for people at the bottom. The problem is not luxury housing. And the problem is not even housing for people at 80% and above of median income. The problem that we've seen repeatedly in the data is for people below 30% and a little bit people below 50%. So we really need to have some focus there. That overlaps with racial equity, but I would absolutely call out racial equity separately. I think that's a really important point.
Dr. Shin, I liked when, I think when you brought it up at the beginning, also noted maybe it's better in that second category, the innovation and accessibility. Maybe that's a better point to call out the lack of access to affordable, how to access to shelter, almost at that, if the lower down the income spectrum that you are, and maybe keep, yeah, that may be one way to approach it, and keep the racial equity in of itself.
Um,
Well,
I'll go with one.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, if it's gonna be there, I agree with Dr. Shin's point. It could be stated there, but I would also say that, you know, Mick, in the conversations I've had about accessibility, I've leaned in on it in that exact manner, right? You create housing, and we can create 15,000 units a year, and it's like that's great, but if they're not accessible to the people most in need, we still have failed. And I think to Dr. Shin's point, that is a priority and should be prominent. Very visibly and very clearly. I still do not see hands, but Emily, I see you unmuted. So,
Sorry, I'm bad about raising my hand. Ed.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I'm monitoring. Go for it.
Under access, and related to what Beth said, but different, is I don't feel like we're capturing economic mobility, and so there's nothing particularly clear around like home ownership, but we know that home ownership is the dominant source of wealth creation for people of color, and obviously it's the same with stabilizing people in affordable rentals. It is about promoting economic mobility through residential stability and affordability. So I would like access, I think, to capture those concepts.
Now, of course, the follow-up question, how do you suggest that we do that?
I don't know if these are the only 4 values and this is like a list, so we're just trying to fit things in. I don't know like exactly what approach we're using right now, but that's just something that feels missing for me.
No, fair enough. So there are a total of 4. Again, and maybe Hannah, you can toggle to the and I don't want to put words in your mouth. I don't know if it goes into the resiliency piece, but our thought was that with values, not less is more, as in you shouldn't have more values, but it's kind of like a mantra, right? You have it and you feel like it guides everything. It doesn't need to be a lot of words, it doesn't need to be a lot of phrases, but it embodies what the group has said. But if you feel that 4 lacks a critical component and it does not find a home underneath one of these 4 titles, or wordsmithing one of the titles in itself, is not a way to capture it, then again, the input on values is not closed. So by all means, make a case for adding one that is specific to addressing that.
I mean, I think racial equity and the access category can fit economic mobility and then access to home ownership. So I think that they can fit there. I just didn't see it in the notes so far.
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah. But one thing that I would add to resilience is, I think that the value of creating permanently affordable housing has come up time and time again in our discussions. And I think linking permanence with resiliency would be important. Whether that's permanently supported housing or community land trust models, or making sure that, when we're doing pilots, we're extending the term from 10 years to as long as possible, or, whatever else.
So Hannah, I think, the challenges, as we already knew, going to be condensing and compiling these. But again, everyone, the more you can say gives Hannah and anybody else who looks at this, even myself as a co-chair, we're going to distill from what's here. I think one of the great phrases that Dia gave us kind of starting off is, silence is compliance. And so if you are seeing things or you're not seeing things, I guess the better way to phrase it, here that are representative of your personal feelings or something that you recall the group having brought up and it's not represented in the category or it's not phrased appropriately, now is the time to let us know.
I saw Kelsey's hand go up and go down twice, so I just wanted to note that.
I was just gonna recognize that what I'm hearing is that there are several things that seem to span multiple values, which I think is exactly what we're going for. That you know, these, like, homeownership is obviously a way to build resilience, address racial equity, like it hits on multiple things. And so I think that just sort of, to me, hits on the fact that we're going for recommendations that do kind of address or can be connected through these different lenses. So that was all I was going to add.
Kelsey, I think that's great, and you're right. I think that shows the power of the values. Again, the goal is that our outcomes align with all of these values, and so that being interconnectivity being shown is great. I do not see any other hands or anyone unmuted at the moment. Hannah, if you would really quick for me, would you go back to connected? I was trying to read that one. Sorry.
I have a process question for the group. Knowing that you know, these need some refinement and condensing to be sort of an effective definition, I'm curious how folks want to create that kind of definition. Would it be helpful for our co-chairs to take a stab at drafting something? Do we want a small group to really focus on one of them and sort of collaborate on a definition? I just want to get some feedback on how we take what's on the slide now to a value statement or set of questions that we're all comfortable with.
Don't see any hands or anyone unmuted related to that question. I guess it's is it the goal of the task force to continue to empower their co-chairs and subcommittee co-chairs to push this forward, or is there a desire that there is an engagement across the entire task force? And if silence persists, I guess that would just be, it would be at the helm of co-chairs as it has been. That's why we elected co-chairs. The other thing I will say, because I want to be mindful of time, I know mixed group went over, jab, but want to be mindful of time. One request that I've had, well, two things that came up that I remember hearing earlier, the desire to have a glossary. We did not necessarily state that in our group, but I think that probably would be something helpful, especially if our group seems to be leaning more towards the technical aspects of suggestions. It may be even more necessary, Hannah, to really look at a glossary of terms if the report starts to go in that fashion. And then the other thing, I've had a couple people email and request that these PowerPoints be shared. And so I'm pretty sure that will happen. So I just want to leave everyone with confidence that you will get the opportunity to digest these at your own time, your own speed, and give feedback to myself, co-chairs, and staff. With that being said, and I always turn to Hannah or Dia or somebody who knows better than me. If there's anything else we need to leave with, please let me know. Currently, we are scheduled to meet as an entire task force a week from today at the same time at 5 o'clock. So we don't have to adjust, just the preservation committee does. But I do want to let everyone know that we do want feedback communication all up until and before and even during that time if it needs to be via email or any other type of communication. So please don't be bashful about this because, as Hannah said, we want this to be a product of our efforts collectively. Well, I'm doing a last check for hands. I think, Mick, you're unmuted, so I'll turn it to you last. Your time doesn't count against our overall meeting.
So it's hearing this discussion, this may not be accurate, but I feel like what everyone would love to see is getting beyond the headlines. Where's the story here? What is this going to look like? So, Hannah, I'm going to throw this over to you and ask you a question. Do you think it would be possible to get, or do you think it would be a good idea also to get not necessarily a polished draft, but even just a Times New Romany Word document with some pages on it, with some overall recommendations, the sub recommendations associated with it, maybe a little bit of time frame, maybe a little bit of numbers as starts for discussion purposes and out in advance of Thursday's meeting, so that folks have a chance to review, have a look, tell us what we're missing. To me, why this becomes particularly important, as I was reviewing where the highest recommendations were, where the question of values really jumped out to me, and sometimes I like to think about them as guiding principles. What's missed from the survey results? Let's make sure we're making positive and affirmative statement. How do we steer these recommendations in the right direction, first and foremost, towards a city with greater racial equity than it has right now? We prove this. So, so part of me feels like these recommendations and these value statements are in conversation with each other. That may not be how other people think about it. So I guess break that question down again. So do you think it would be possible to get a draft? And obviously we'll offer some support, but also knowing that may fall mostly on your desk.
Yes, I think anything is possible. I'm also conscious of probably circling up with you co-chairs based on some of the feedback we got at the last meeting and potentially pushing our final meeting out 2 weeks and doing a check-in next week, and then having more developed product available for folks on the 29th. So I think I'd rather circle up with you guys to sort of debrief the 2 meetings today, see where we are, and then be able to send out an update to folks.
Great. That sounds good.
Okay. Well, I will again push to close the meeting. I don't see any hands. Mick, the comments and the extra time was well utilized, so thank you for that. All of our task force members and staff, thank you so much. I appreciate the time this evening. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.